Now, today we're going to be talking about chapter 29, section 2. It's titled The Triumphs of a Crusade. Now, the crusade that we're talking about today is the civil rights movement, the struggle for equality. And civil rights activists did manage to break through racial barriers. Now, when I say activist, that's someone who chooses to actively get involved in changing and fixing an injustice in society. People realized the government was not representing them and was not going to seek justice on their behalf. And so in a democracy, it becomes the responsibility of a people to seek justice for themselves. That means individual responsibility. And that's where activism comes in. Now, this story of activism did prompt significant legislation. And we live in the generation right after that. Now, just because this was a generation ago, in the 1960s, it doesn't mean that all the civil rights movement, all the activism has already happened and all the injustice in the world is already fixed. We are in the midst of a modern-day civil rights movement. And many people yet again feel that in many aspects of American life, our government does not represent us. And yet again, the onus lies on us, the individual American, to do something about it. If we want justice in this world, we have to seek it for ourselves, and we're not alone. And that's what the civil rights movement was all about, is that sometimes we have to shame the powerful in this world into doing good. And if we remain silent, well, then we are a part of the problem. Now, in 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality tested the Supreme Court decision banning interstate bus segregation. Yet again, here's another case. So the Supreme Court has made a ruling. It should have the power of law, but it requires the president to enforce it. Same with the Congress. And as we see with any unpopular law, people will choose to break it, hoping for government inaction, hoping for apathy. As we saw in the case of Prohibition, where widespread disobedience led to eventual repeal. But in this case, the disobedience was an injustice committed against minorities, and that was segregation. Now segregation has been outlawed thanks to Brown v. Board and thanks to cases outlawing segregation in buses throughout the United States. However, it took the courage of people willing to sit on the front of buses, black Americans willing to sit on white-only buses. Now, they would often do this in states which were more tolerant, northern states. And then they would get bus tickets and they would ride down to southern states where this could cause problems. They called themselves the Freedom Riders. These young blacks and whites would sit on these buses and they would ride down to states like Alabama. In one case, one of these buses was actually set on fire by an angry mob that surrounded the bus on the streets of Alabama. Out of safety concerns, some bus companies said they would no longer carry these Freedom Riders. Out of fear. Because white terrorists were attacking these Freedom Riders in southern states. And it was working. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the more extreme fringe of the civil rights movement, said they would continue to ride on these buses even if it got them killed. And in many cases, they were violently stopped. It did get them beaten. It did get them tortured. It did get them arrested. They would go into southern states where the states were refusing to obey the Supreme Court ruling, and they would drag these people off the buses and beat them. But yet again, here we find a president unwilling to act and forced into action by courageous and determined people. Because yet again, as these people were being beaten, they were smart enough to invite the media. And the media was filming this. And that's shameful. A peaceful country that has fought the Nazis is now attacking minorities simply because they're becoming too uppity by choosing to ride on a bus which was reserved for white passengers. How dare they, right? And it's embarrassing for a country which is supposed to be the leader of a free world, and it's only providing freedom for a certain portion of its population. And so this action of being willing to get beaten for the sake of justice forced the president into action. In fact, President Kennedy ordered the Attorney General, his brother, Robert Kennedy, to pressure the bus companies to continue transporting these riders.
The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is a museum of artifacts from the bad old days. To some, they might seem to be relics of a very distant past. Among them, the jail cell that held Martin Luther King Jr. years before he became a martyred icon.
We still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, that he who lives by the sword will perish by the sword.
In 1961, Bob Filner was locked in a cell just like this one.
To think I spent a month and a half in this size cell. We had roughly the same size, although there was a double-decker bunk.
Now, he's a U.S. congressman, but back then, Filner was one scared college sophomore.
We never got out. Once a week for a shower down the hall. We were proud because we were the first integrated cell block in Mississippi history.
You've heard about it, read about it, but in 1961, people were ready to kill and others were ready to die over the issues of whether blacks and whites could use the same toilet, the same water fountain, the same waiting room at a bus station.
I am not going to serve you because of my race. I'm not going to serve you.
A federal court ruled that no state could discriminate against interstate travelers, that they had the right to disregard local segregation ordinances. That's what the court said. Local citizens begged to differ.
Well, we were aboard a Greyhound bus coming into Birmingham. At Anniston, we were surrounded by a mob. They started breaking the windows of the bus with chains and pipes and one thing and another. They finally threw a bomb into the bus. The bus filled very rapidly with black smoke.
We saw that iconic picture on television of the bus burning. I was studying for my final exam. When I saw that bus on fire, I said, I got to be there.
I'd like to see the show of hands of those of you who will be willing to continue the Freedom Ride in the near future. Let's see the show of hands, please.
They hopped on trailways and Greyhound buses in the north, young blacks and young whites, and they headed south. Freedom Riders, somebody called them, and the label stuck.
They put us on a bus, 3 or 4 or 5 of us, whoever happened to be there at that moment who had responded to their call. And we didn't know exactly where we would end up. We didn't know, 1, if we'd end up alive, 2, what state we'd end up, whether they would arrest us, beat us up, or send us home. Nobody knew. So we ended up in Jackson, Mississippi. We got off the bus, we walked together, black and white, into the white waiting room, which was illegal. There was a big mob outside waiting for us. I guess it was fortunate that the cops surrounded us.
Think the mob would have hurt you?
Oh, yeah, no question. I mean, we saw James Peck in Birmingham, 100 stitches in his head because he was almost killed. People had, clubs and axes. I mean, they were not in a pleasant mood.
Catherine Burks Brooks, a black student activist, was on a freedom ride to Montgomery, Alabama.
We rolled up in the bus station. Just a few people milling around, not that many. But then looked like all of a sudden all hell broke loose. Looked like white people came from everywhere. And one thing that stands out right now in my mind, were the women that were there with babies in their arm, screaming, "Kill them niggers." They got the photographers and the newspaper people first before they started in on us.
What occurred really was a way to reach the moral consciousness of America, because what America saw was a lot of young people, although there were older people there, black and white, who voluntarily put themselves in positions where they can get beaten up, killed, and then in prison for months.
Getting imprisoned was all part of the strategy.
We must now fill the jail and be willing to remain for at least a minimum of 60 days or more.
And that's what happened in Jackson, Mississippi, with the result that they were moved to the notorious state penitentiary at Parchman Farm, where they were held on death row.
All the leadership of the civil rights movement really went through that Parchman training. I mean, it was like boot camp, because virtually everybody became a leader when they left. When I got off that bus, nobody would ever predicted, one, that I would have survived a couple months in jail, or two, that I would become a congressman.
Extraordinary talent.
Nor would anyone in his wildest imaginings have predicted that one of Bob Filner's colleagues in the Congress would be that young black man, Arthur Davis. They used to call this place
Birmingham.
Birmingham.
Yeah, that's right. An international reputation.
For my generation, people over 60, the statues in this park evoke black and white film images that filled our television screens night after night in 1963. For Davis, a full generation younger, this was all history.
Some people thought that those images were too stark, with the teeth and the boy leaning backwards. The images are stark because the events were pretty horrific.
And the most horrifying incident from that bloody era occurred when the Ku Klux Klan set off a bomb that killed 4 little black girls in this church.
You couldn't grow up in Alabama and be historically alert and not know about these things. A whole string of racial violence in this state for a period of about 16, 17 years. The brutal beating and attacks on children who were demonstrating, and slaughter of 4 little girls in this very sanctuary in September 1963.
All that before Davis was born. But then,
in 1981, an event that I suppose we believe is the last known lynching in American history, a young man named Michael Donald in Mobile, Alabama.
Ah yes, the last lynching. That story when we come back.
Now, Robert Kennedy, Attorney General of the United States in the early 1960s, ordered that the bus companies continue to allow to carry these passengers because the Supreme Court has now ordered they have a right to be on the bus. Yet, the Alabama officials, which have no right legally to remove them from the bus, don't give them protection. So they say, okay, we have no right legally to remove you from the bus. Well, we're certainly not exactly going to be following your bus with the police cars. They don't give the protection that they were supposed to give. And so angry mobs surround the buses because the angry mobs know, because I'm sure leaders of these mobs, the Klan, are closely affiliated with Alabama state officials, and they understand and know that the cops aren't going to be anywhere around this bus, and they can do whatever they want. And so that's how you wind up with situations where angry mobs surround buses and throw bombs into them. Because ordinarily, your average state patrol officer would come through, see this sort of thing, call in for support, and break up a riot, because that's part of their job. But it doesn't happen. So, again, these people aren't stupid. They have photographers with them. They have video cameras with them. And as you saw on the film, often the mobs would attack the journalist first. But of course, newspapers began to denounce these beatings. everyone watching television is seeing these things. And so Kennedy finally orders U.S. Marshals, one U.S. Marshal for every bus riding into the South. U.S. Marshals are some of the only officials authorized to carry weapons on buses or planes. And so they are sent to attack a federal marshal as a federal crime. And so they are sent into Alabama to protect these riders. And the Attorney General uses the Interstate Commerce Commission Act to ban segregation in all interstate travel facilities. So the federal court ordered that buses be integrated. Alabama said they don't have to follow that within their own state law. So the Attorney General used the Interstate Commerce Act to say any vehicle transporting passengers between states falls under the protection of the federal government. Now the case of Ole Miss. In 1962, a federal court rules that James Meredith may enroll in the University of Mississippi because of Brown v. Board. Yet again, we find a situation where the governor of the state stood in front of the door of the University of Mississippi, yet again with an angry mob and his National Guard, to ban James Meredith from registering to enroll at the university. By the way, the state of Mississippi's flag still contains the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag was raised at Columbia, South Carolina in the 1960s, shortly after Brown v. Board, in response to school integration. So though the Confederate flag may also be a symbol of the state of the battle flag of the Army of Virginia, it became a symbol of opposition to civil rights in the 1960s. And really it had long been a symbol of that before. So, yet again, we have another governor standing in front of his school, refusing to let a black student in. And again, the black student who's invited the media is brave enough to refuse to obey the governor because he knows he has the federal government on his side, that the Supreme Court has ruled that he has a right to enter this university, and that not even a state governor has the right to refuse his admittance. And so yet again, President forced into action. He ordered the federal marshals to escort this young man into the registrar so that he may enroll in the university. So Ross Barnett, governor of Mississippi, gets on the radio and tells the loyal, patriotic citizens of the state of Mississippi to rebel against the tyrannical federal government that has sought to assert its unlawful will upon the peaceful people of Mississippi. And they do. Thousands of people start breaking things, start burning things, start attacking African Americans in the state of Mississippi. As the federal marshals accompany this young man and have to provide federal police protection to a black man getting uppity enough to enroll in a university in the sacred state of Mississippi. Now, in April of 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference formed a demonstration to desegregate the city of Birmingham, considered one of the most racist and bigoted places in the country. Dr. King gets arrested for trying to desegregate this capital of racism in the South, and he writes a letter from the Birmingham jail. And we'll look at the letter in just a moment. The TV shows the police attacking child marchers using fire hoses on innocent people, using dogs to attack, and clubs to beat. Yet these protests continue. They lead to an eventual economic boycott of all city businesses. And yet again, they invited the media. And eventually segregation came to an end in Birmingham, Alabama. Now,
a bullet from the back of a bush took Medgar Evers' blood.
Now in June of 1963, just months before his assassination, John F. Kennedy sent troops to force the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, to desegregate the University of Alabama. Meanwhile, an officer of the NAACP, Medgar Evers, was murdered by two members of the Ku Klux Klan. And they were let go, scotch-free, in a hung jury. Hung jury means the jury could not decide on the guilt of these two men who murdered in cold blood someone who was seeking equality, who had harmed no one, and was murdered simply because these men felt he had become uppity. And again, the song that Bob Dylan wrote suggested that these men were but a pawn in the game of more powerful people. And the killers were set free.
A bullet from the back of a bush took Medgar Evers' blood. A finger fired the trigger to his name. A handle hit out in the dark. A hand sent the spark. Two eyes took the aim. Behind a man's brain. But he can't be blamed. He's only a pawn in their game. The South politician preaches to the poor white man. You got more than the blacks, don't complain. You're better than them, you've been born with white skin, they explain. And the Negro's name is used, it is plain, for the politician's gain as he rises to fame. And the poor white remains on the caboose of the train, so it ain't him to blame. He's only a pawn in their game. The deputy sheriffs, the soldiers, the governors get paid. And the marshals and cops get the same. But the poor white man's used in the hands of them all like a tool. He's taught in his school from the start by the rule that the laws are with him to protect his white skin, to keep up his hate, so he never thinks straight about the shape that he's in. So it ain't him to blame. He's only a pawn in their game. From the poverty shacks, he looks from the cracks to the tracks. And the hoofbeats pound in his brain. And he's taught how to walk in a pack, shoot in the back with his fist in a clinch, to hang and to lynch, to hide neath a hood, to kill with no pain, like a dog on a chain. He ain't got no name, but it ain't him to blame. He's only a pawn in their game. To the day Medgar Evers was buried from the bullet he caught. They lowered him down as a king, but when the shadowy sun sets on the one that fired the gun, you'll see by his grave, on the stone that remains, carved next to his name, his epitaph plain, only a pawn in their game.
Now, the moment you've all heard of, in August of 1963, over 250,000 people converged on the Washington Mall, met and rallied and camped for several days around the Washington Monument. Speakers during this rally demanded immediate passage of a civil rights bill. Of course, the most famous of these speeches was Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which we'll listen to a quote from in a moment. And as we listen to it, I'll also pause and ask you, what would such a world look like where Dr. King's hopes were fulfilled? What would such a place be like? And I also want you to think about Washington, D.C. Think about the place. Think about where all of this occurred. It was a big moment. And yes, it was a beautiful moment. But it's part of a long and ongoing process to get people to treat others as equal. And we're not there yet, ladies and gentlemen. We're not. Because people are still attempting to use us as tools. Now, September of the same year, 4 young girls were murdered in the fellowship hall of their church, which was below the sanctuary, as they were preparing a meal for dinner that night for their congregation. Members of the Ku Klux Klan threw a bomb into the church. Later claimed they did not intend to hurt the young girls. They did not know they were there, yet it happened nonetheless that these white terrorists threw a bomb into a church in Birmingham, Alabama. And of all the peaceful protests and movements, this tragic event made it clear the real intentions of the segregationist and polarized public opinion. And it is tragic that these young girls had to give their lives, something they never thought they would have to do, something they didn't want to do. They were just young girls. They just wanted to make a meal. But this polarized public sentiment in a way that perhaps it hadn't yet. Sometimes it takes a tragedy to make people realize what's actually going on. Think of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, when 194 women perished pointlessly in a fire. And then finally the city started doing something about it, started requiring that factories obey the existing laws. And nobody, people didn't want to think about racism, and then 4 young girls died in a church. And then suddenly it becomes real for a lot of people that chose to ignore it. What is it going to take for us today to realize the effect of this hatred? Is it going to take innocent people getting killed before we realize what's going on? Sadly, it's probably going to take that. And it's probably going to come to that. I hope I'm wrong. But eventually, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, gender, ethnic origin, etc.
The The high point of the civil rights movement of the early 60s took place the following summer in Washington. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 Americans from all parts of the country converged for the largest demonstration ever held in the Capitol. And the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King drew the attention of the nation and the world.
But I have a dream. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. To you today, my friend, let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Now, Dr. King's speech was part of the movement that became Freedom Summer. After the signing of the 64 Civil Rights Act into law, yes, a historic law, yes, an important one, yes, one of my favorites. But a law has to be enforced. And a law can require implementation, and an unpopular law is going to be resisted, bar none. And so Freedom Summer became a goal to register blacks to vote, even in states like Mississippi. And again, volunteers were beaten, some killed. Businesses and homes and churches were set on fire, not only by the Klan, but by many others. People in the state of Mississippi formed their own political party. They called it the Freedom Democratic Party. And the voice of this party, Fannie Lou Hamer, gained national support. Now, Johnson was afraid of losing the last bit of Southern white Democratic support. Many had already turned against the Democratic Party because of their association with the civil rights movement. Johnson was afraid of, oh dear, states are going to start voting red. Gee, guess what happened? So he was afraid of that. He tried to pressure leaders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to compromise. Oh, blacks actually voting and following the 15th Amendment is too much to ask. We're not ready for that yet as a nation. He was concerned about losing support in the South. This very same man that signed into law the 64 Civil Rights Act.
Before the 1964 presidential elections, Hundreds of volunteers, white and black, traveled to Mississippi to help register black voters. It would later become known as Freedom Summer.
Blacks were legally able to vote, but in many places in the country, when they got to the polling place, they would be given tests on Chaucer, on arcane examples of 14th century English law, things that no one could possibly pass.
In Alabama, in Georgia, in Mississippi, you had to pass a so-called literacy test. On one occasion, a man was asked to give the number of bubbles in a bar of soap.
Despite the efforts of civil rights workers, not enough new black voters are registered to have an impact on the presidential election. At the same time, many Southern white Democrats are leaving the party because of Johnson's strong support of civil rights.
Johnson's opponent would be Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Goldwater said, I'm not against civil rights, but I think this bill, the Civil Rights Bill, is unconstitutional. People got the message, especially in the white South, and Johnson was agonized to see that in his home region, very quickly in the polls, Goldwater was getting about 80% to Johnson's 20%.
Johnson wins the election by a landslide, but it's clear he's lost voters in the South, a fact noted by black leaders.
Martin Luther King Jr., he had a conversation with President Johnson, and he said, we need a voting rights act.
Johnson says, well, I'm for voting rights, but this ain't the time.
But civil rights leaders don't want to wait. In the spring of 1965, they pressure Johnson to act, staging a nonviolent march in the little-known town of Selma, Alabama.
In Selma, Alabama, in 1965, only 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote. So on Sunday, March 7, 1965, about 600 of us held a nonviolent workshop. We lined up in twos to walk from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the nation that people of color wanted to register to vote. We came to the apex of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, crossing the Alabama River. On the other side, you saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers.
Advance toward the group. See that they turn around and disperse.
You saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us. Beating us with nightsticks and bull whips, tramping us with horses, releasing the tear gas.
A lot of white Americans were on the fence on civil rights. Then they saw those pictures on television from Selma. That was something new and horrible. It converted a lot of Americans.
Johnson clearly saw that march as something that would help him get the Voting Rights Act passed.
So that was known as the Selma Campaign. In 1965, a voting rights demonstrator was murdered in this town for trying to register blacks to vote. As you heard, there was only roughly 2% of black Americans in the town of Selma of voting age that were registered to vote. So almost no blacks were voting in Selma, Alabama. Someone stood up and said, hey, we should get blacks registered to vote in Selma, Alabama, and they killed him. So Dr. King led about 600 protesters who were brave enough to cross into this town to try to register to vote, and you just saw for yourself what happened. The state of Alabama sent the police to beat and shoot tear gas and ride horses into these crowds. But yet again, the media was there, documenting all of this. And guess what? A second march was held. And this time 25,000 people showed up. And what are they going to do against 25,000 people? The point I'm trying to make is sometimes the government's not on our side. And sometimes it takes us getting involved and organizing to make a change. Now, that's the beauty of a democracy. You know, our founding fathers realized that sometimes our government would get corrupt, that our government wouldn't always be on our side. And so embedded within the Constitution is the idea that the people hold the ultimate powers of society. And it took brave people standing up, yes, to our government, to force our government to act, and finally Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This outlawed literacy tests. It allowed not state officials but federal officials to enroll voters who answered to the President of the United States. And the end result of this was a great increase in black enrollment. It's amazing stuff, folks. And what I hope you realize is it's not just something that happened in the 1960s, it's something that's happening today. The need for concerned, compassionate, and active citizens is more pressing than ever. You know, this is not just history class. This is me trying to get you to wake up and realize what the heck is going on today. And to understand that unless we do something, our government will continue to turn a blind eye to injustice. That it often takes we the people to unite and seek change. We cannot rely on others.